Okay, welcome to this seminar where we'll be looking at the translation of research into population health benefits and looking at the AI opportunity for that. For the first slot, I'd like to introduce Anne-Marie, who is part of the research program investigating the impact of select dietary components and a Mediterranean-style dietary pattern on cardiometabolic and cognitive health. Having completed her first degree in nutrition and biochemistry at University College Cork, she moved to the UK to complete her PhD. She's been based here ever since, apart from a one-year stay at the Auckland Medical School. The title of Anne-Marie's presentation is around the Norwich Institute of Healthy Aging and the role that AI has in designing and implementing behaviour change strategies. So Anne-Marie, if I can hand over to yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve. So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to just spend the next 10 minutes or so introducing to you a new institute which we've launched at UEA and across the research park called Norwich Institute of Healthy Aging, and just to provide a little bit of insight into what we perceive the role of AI and machine learning will be in the delivery of our research programs. So the partners of our institute are as follows. Within UEA, we have Norwich Medical School, Health Sciences, Biological Sciences, Computing Sciences, and the Business School. We've very much engaged with our NHS partners, UEA Health and Social Care partners. Also, a big component part of our new institute is our interactions with Norwich City Council and Norfolk County Council. And of course, critical to any such institute is our commercial partners. Now, the remit of the institute goes right from fundamental discovery research in health and behaviors and aging, right through to how the delivery of effectiveness studies at a community level. But a big component or a focus for us is conducting work which helps span this very well recognized translational valley of death between the fundamental research and its translation into community and public health benefit and product and services innovation. And we see very much that big data analysis, AI and machine learning will be very much a component part of that translational pathway. The remit of the Institute looks at health in its broader sense, and not just the absence of disease or physical and mental well-being, but also those other important components of human flourishing, such things as personal happiness, a life with meaning and purpose, a life aligned with one's character, and our lives being well socially connected. The work of the Institute really builds on the breadth and depth of behaviour research we have ongoing across Norwich Research Park, and particularly in nutrition and eating behaviour, but also a lot of work that's ongoing in smoking cessation, the effects of physical activity on health and healthy ageing, the effects of sleep and health, medication adherence, and also weight management. So it's looking at behaviours in very much a composite way. When we look at this typical model of public health and approaches to increasing life expectancy and healthy life expectancy, and I'll divert your attention here to the bottom panel, at a population level, the enactment of healthy behaviours is seen as a critical step in not only increasing increasing life expectancy, but also compressing that period of ill health right towards the latter parts of life. But increasingly, we're beginning to recognize that our ability to enact health behaviors is much more than education and willpower. And that it's affected by a whole host of social, cultural, economic, geographical, and environmental determinants. So a big aim for us in the Institute is to really recognize and address these determinants in the health services and community-based interventions that we hope to deliver. A second strategic aim is to look at behaviours in a much more integrated way. Traditionally, research and policy has looked at one behaviour at a time, the effects of nutrition on health, the effects of smoking cessation on health. But of course, as individuals and communities, our health is very much a composite of those things. And lastly, the Institute is providing us with added value and providing us with the leadership and infrastructure and international reputation to successfully bid for and deliver these multi-agency research programs with commercial partners front and center of this research that we hope to deliver. It's important for us that our work, our institute, not only provides added value, but that's very much aligned with the external landscape. And the work that we hope to do is very much aligned with the Healthy Aging Government Grand Challenge, which is very ambitious indeed, which aims to increase healthy life expectancy by 5 years by 2035, and importantly, to really address those health inequalities. Also, NIHA is very aligned with the changing tide in the NHS, which is much more focused going forward on prevention. And when we look at major funders such as UKRI, the research program we hope to deliver very much fits under key strategic areas listed here under 6.1 and 6.2, but also actually 6.3 and 6.4. But healthy aging over the life course is the major theme of the Institute. And where are we? Well, we've just launched, actually. We've had 2 very successful launches, a public launch in November, a partner launch last week or in early February. We have our management group in place. We have our themes identified, and we're just starting to get our program of research going. We've to date submitted 3 grant applications, and there's 7 more which are at the various stages of planning. So that's the Institute. For the next couple of minutes now, I'd just like to provide you just a little bit of insight into how AI and machine learning and big data analysis can contribute to the work we hope to do. This is a very nice article, which many of you may have seen, which was published in Nature Medicine a few weeks ago, which just lists the areas where machine learning can contribute to medicine, from reconstructing of disease and to phenotyping of disease, right through to driving collaborations. And we see all of these areas as being important for NIHA program delivery. When we look at nutritional sciences specifically, which is my personal area of interest and expertise, for sure the areas identified in the previous slides are all of interest. But when we specifically look at nutritional sciences, machine learning and AI has a critical role to play in the identification of individuals when they're preclinical or prodromal. And these are the people we really need to intervene in early in order to prevent people progressing to full-blown disease. Also, a huge role to play in the integration of nutrition with other data in risk prediction, looking at the effects of establishing synergy or additive effects between different dietary components. AI and machine learning has a really important role to play in the triaging of individuals. So what dietary strategies are best for individuals based on their personal data, which often personal data is hugely complicated. And I'd just like to very briefly just elaborate on 2 areas in particular: the role of machine learning and AI in the personalization of dietary recommendations and in the support of people in their efforts to change their eating behavior. Precision medicine is the notion that we design dietary recommendations for individuals to suit their particular circumstance and makeup. And this infographic just shows really nicely of the many factors which contribute to a person's nutritional needs, going from nutrition and food availability to their genetics, to their anthropometry, to their sex, etc. Now, as you can see, this is hugely complicated, way beyond human capability to define. So we see a huge role for AI and machine learning in the integration of all of this data to provide folks with personalized nutrition advice. And an example we're really interested in my research group is E4 females. E4 is a particular genotype which puts you at increased risk of dementia and cognitive decline. If you happen to be female, then the effects of E4 genotype is far more significant. So what we're trying to establish is what is the basis for this increased risk in E4 females. And once we know this, start to design dietary strategies to mitigate that increased risk. And again, there's a huge amount of data which goes into the derivation of this, and a huge need for AI and machine learning in helping us to integrate and interpret that data. And what we're hoping, of course, you'd be forgiven for thinking that we're all going to develop dementia if you based your assessment on the huge focus in the media at the moment. But the reality is that only 7% of us over the age of 65 actually have dementia. And the trick is, how can we define personalized dietary strategies to ensure we remain in that 93% bubble of folks who don't develop dementia? The second area I'd like to highlight is how machine learning and AI can support us in our endeavors to adapt healthier eating behaviors at an individual and population level. Behavior is much more than education and willpower. It's influenced by a whole host of factors. And as you can see in the 3 bullet points here, there's a huge role to play in much more sophisticated analysis of available data to establish what best approaches to suit people in their eating behavior change endeavor in order to provide people with the capability and the motivation and the opportunities to adopt sustained, healthier eating behaviors. I'll finish on this. If you're interested at all in anything I've presented to you today and in the work of the Institute, we'd be delighted to hear from you. We've got a website there, there's contact details on there, but please just drop me an email and I'd be delighted to hear from you with any ideas you may have. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I'd be interested to know from your perspective, what do you see as being the more important aspect for health? Is it nature or is it nurture? So is it the genetics or is it the behavior that people exhibit?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, traditionally we've got this information from a huge amount of work that's been done in identical or non-identical twins. And from that work, it's been assumed that our overall health is about 50% genetics, 50% environment or behavior. But actually, that does seem to depend on what condition you're talking about. So for osteoporosis, there's a much greater genetic component. For gut health, there's a much bigger environmental component or behavioral component. And actually, in order to establish that with any great precision, we need to really integrate the huge amount of data that's available to us. So I would say about 50-50 at the moment, but we really need to get down to the subtleties of that when we're looking at individual conditions.
Okay, great, thanks. So I guess, again, linked into the behavior side of things, I mean, what role do you see that poverty and socioeconomic situations or status has in the ability of individuals to enact healthier behaviors?
Yeah, this is a call to action, really. I was reading a statistic yesterday that in England and Wales at the moment, there's 19 years difference in healthy life expectancy between the poorest and the richest in this country, which I think is a really shameful statistic. So, I mean, I think poverty and lack of social and economic means has a huge contribution to health inequalities and to poor behaviors. And actually, when we're designing products and services, we really need to be cognizant of this and design products and interventions and strategies which serve the whole population and not just the worried well or the classes who can afford them.
Okay, great, thanks. And I guess in a similar vein, I mean, what do you think is the most critical part of the life course to enact the healthier behaviors? Is it from birth or is it something that people can do at a later date?
Yeah. I mean, the problem is with all of us, we only start to worry about these things when we start to get a bit creaky. And actually, the best chance we have at really increasing healthy life expectancy is to adapt these things right throughout life. Actually, the most influential period is when we can do little about it, which is in utero, in the womb. But actually the first year of life is critically important. And then after that, behavior is important right throughout life. So I suppose the best message is the earlier you start, the better it is. And at a population level, the longer will be your healthy life expectancy.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Steve.
So now I'd like to introduce Saber, who obtained his PhD in biomedical science and engineering from the Center for Sensory Motor Interaction at Aalborg University in Denmark. Subsequently, he's held research appointments at Aalborg, the University of Birmingham, and the University of Cambridge. He also joined UEA in 2017 and holds the position of senior lecturer in dementia research. Saber's line of investigation is inherently multidisciplinary, utilizing multimodal imaging, behavioral methods, and computational modeling to better understand cortical reorganization in chronic conditions. Saber's more recent work in the Department of Clinical Neurosciences at the University of Cambridge has been the study of the healthy aging population and chronic conditions, including the effects of dementia on the brain. So Saber will be talking about the field of dementia and how technology can support this work. Saber, over to yourself.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AI Festival. Today my name is Dr. Saber Sami, and I'm a senior lecturer in dementia research at the University of Anglia. I'm going to be speaking about the role for AI in dementia research, and I'll allude on some of the research that we've been doing at the Norwich Medical School related to dementia and also COVID-19. So dementia is a public health priority. It is currently the leading cause of death in the United Kingdom since 2016. And it also is very widespread, with around over 1 million people being affected by it in the UK currently. It's not only a UK problem, it's a global problem. As you can see from this slide, which was published by the World Health Organization, that there have been over 45 million people worldwide, and this is earlier data from 2014, who suffered from dementia. This number is increasing rapidly due to the aging population, which Anne-Marie previously alluded to. So as you can see from this slide, published by Alzheimer's Research UK, that the global increase in the aging population is not only limited to high-income countries, but also to low and middle-income countries. And this is increasing exponentially in the low and middle-income countries. So this is currently a global problem, and therefore we have to have some new means to address this problem. When I speak of dementia, dementia is an umbrella term. So it is not one single disease, but a host of disorders or neurological disorders. Among them are vascular dementias, which are related to stroke, induced cognitive decline. There are language-related dementias, like primary progressive aphasias. There are behavioral types of dementias, like the frontotemporal dementias. And something that is very widespread and well-known is Alzheimer's dementia, which is related to cognitive and memory decline. This is the most widespread type of dementia. It affects around 65 to 75% of all people affected by dementia. So this brings me to the big question of, why hasn't there been a cure in dementia? Why haven't we been able to resort to some kind of mechanistic understanding in dementia? And there were high hopes in the early 2000s with the Human Genome Project that we will be able to understand the basis of dementia through genetics. Unfortunately, this hasn't panned out because, as you can see from this slide I'm presenting here by Vilmarge 2015, they showed that there's a host of genetic overlaps between the different pathologies of dementia. So, for example, we do know that the frontotemporal dementias overlap strongly with motor neuron diseases, with certain types of proteins clogging the connections in the brain. So there is a large overlap among these different types of genes, and therefore there has to be a new way to address this complicated picture. So AI seems to be one of the mechanisms that can help us understand the complicated picture because it can address complex analysis. By that, I mean, in the past, we normally looked at a few causal factors, few factors, and which we could model mathematically. So we could look at 1, 2, or maybe 3 variables, maximum 5 variables, and how they interact. With AI and machine learning, we have the possibility to look at thousands of variables and how they interact. And this will open up the possibility to understand complex interactions between this type of data. So one of the most important aspects of current research in dementia is trying to understand its earlier evolution. The reason being is an example that I'm showing here from an MR image of a healthy brain, healthy subject's brain, and a dementia, an Alzheimer's dementia patient's brain. So here you can see that in the Alzheimer's brain, there are increased spaces, larger spaces in the human brain. And these spaces are actually the result of brain tissue disappearing and being replaced by fluids. So by the time a patient or a subject is at this stage, it is usually too late to do anything at all. So some of the preventative measures that Anne-Marie alluded to would be unlikely to be helpful at this very late stage. So it's very important to try to catch it early on. So in our labs here at UA Norwich, we're trying to get the most of this AI possibility of looking at large amounts of data through different types of imaging modalities and integrating them together. This is what we call a multimodal integration approach in dementia. So with that, we can look at blood flow and imaging in the brain. We can look at active neuronal responses in the brain, structural changes. We can look at different glucose metabolic changes, and also the types of proteins that might actually be clogging the brain from communicating properly. So we can integrate all this information, and we have now started to work on what we call personalized diagnostics in dementia. By integrating this type of information, we can actually create fingerprints for every individual patient by looking at what each and every single modality presents for that patient. We can create a specific model and see at what stage they might be, and potentially try to address the intervention question. Can we intervene? And how can we intervene? The final part that I'm going to show you today is actually some work that we have been able to do from these types of analysis that we've used in brain imaging, and also from retinal imaging for dementia. And we've tried to translate these imaging pipelines for COVID-19 chest X-ray detection. So what you're seeing here is, and the first part is looking at a patient with bacterial pneumonia. That's part A. Part B is showing a patient with viral pneumonia. And part C is showing a patient with COVID-19 pneumonia. So we've managed to create an AI that can detect these different types of pneumonias, and at the same time show the clinician an explanation of where the spread might be. So this is a part of AI known as explainable AIs, because in the past, AI was just a black box. It would give you just a number. But nowadays, we can actually use it to explain what it finds and and that will help, of course, the clinician to take further action. We've also provided this as an API, which is an open source platform, and any hospital can upload their chest X-rays to this API, and will get an instantaneous response to tell them about the accuracy of that output. So the machines that we've produced actually produce a very high level of accuracy, the AI outputs. So it can discriminate between these different types of pneumonias by around 98 in certain, and for COVID pneumonias, 99 or even 100%. Last but not least, I'd like to tell you something about how AI might help in the healthcare roadmap for dementia patients. So this slide here, this figure, shows an image produced by the Topple report, which looked at health technology interventions for the NHS between 2020 and 2040, creating a roadmap for it. And as you can see, a lot of technologies already exist in this sphere. And among them, all of these technologies include telemedicine, smart apps, reading the genomes. All of these technologies have some form of AI integrated in them. So AI is actually a part of our current intervention approach that we use for dementia, and it is expanding rapidly. As you can see, automated image interpretation is not just happening now, but in the future it will dominate by more than 80% of all radiological outputs. All other sectors will be affected greatly by this. But until that happens, we still have a great deal to do, looking at the quality and integrity of the data, try to reduce the risk of discrimination, because some of the data that the AI is being trained on is not diverse enough. And therefore, we have to create that diversity within the data. There are, of course, privacy matters. So how to keep all the information anonymized and not to affect the participant. And there has to be some form of education around this to help get informed consent for large-scale research of this nature. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Saber. Very interesting and highly important area of work that. So I'd be interested to delve a bit more into your thinking about the role that AI could play in finding a cure for dementia.
Yes, the cure for dementia has been quite a bumpy road, so to speak. Many of us actually don't even dare say the word cure anymore, because there have been a lot of false hopes in this path. But just to give you an idea, more than 100 different drugs have passed a late stage in animal testing, but failed in the final stage of phase 3 implementation, which has cost billions of pounds. So for that very reason, people are very wary of using the term cure. However, AI in its current setting can help us towards prevention. And I think in the near future, if there are many strands that are put together, it may be able to help us or guide us at least to a path for possible cures. But at this point in time, I think we're far away from seeing that, eureka moment, at least, even with AI.
Thanks, Saber. If I can now introduce Beatriz. Beatriz is a data mining researcher with experience of healthcare data analysis. She has worked on the analysis of primary care data sets for cardiovascular disease risk evaluation, on text mining of gastroenterology procedural reports to identify key success indicators, and on linking data in secondary care setting in order to create patient-centric databases suitable for clinical research. She's experienced at developing new data mining algorithms using optimization techniques and has over 60 peer-reviewed publications. As part of the talk, Beatriz will now look at the use of Twitter in extracting the signal for syndromic surveillance and how we are now trying to use this in the context of COVID. Beatriz.
Thank you very much. We are going to talk about tweets to monitor syndromes, and this is as part of the Health Protection Research Unit in Emergency Preparedness and Response, of which I am a part in combination with King's College and Public Health England, and it's the work of a PhD student of mine who is now got his PhD, Dr. Edo Osagi, who worked on this project. So we're going to talk about syndromic surveillance, which is currently very topical with COVID, and that is described by the World Health Organization as the cornerstone of public health security. We are now getting quite used to seeing how COVID is monitored, and in traditional surveillance, most of the work will rely on lab reports, as we're going to see in a moment. But when we come to syndromic surveillance, what we have is methods of health surveillance that use pre-diagnosis data and statistical algorithms to look at epidemics earlier than traditional surveillance. So it's becoming very important in the current scenario. So when we think about how syndromic surveillance happened, when it's with traditional symptoms, what we have is generally somebody goes to the doctor. Let's say they have maybe COVID, although of course, if they had COVID, they wouldn't be that close to the doctor. There'll be a little bit more distance. And they have a test. It could be influenza, it could be any other disease, dengue, anything. And that gets sent to the labs for analysis. That test is analyzed and the results are sent back, and that gets reported at some point. So in traditional surveillance, we have like a delay of 1 to 2 weeks, maybe, for all of these different steps to happen between somebody saying they have a disease or they think they have a disease, and that disease making it into the public health kind of like reporting systems. Now, in syndromic surveillance, what happens is we have very good systems in the UK under Public Health England, where they have come to use this pre-diagnostic information. So some of the sources that they use every day for looking at different diseases and syndromes are the NHS 111 call. So if you call 111 and you report something, that gets recorded and it gets analyzed at the end of the day. People that attend emergency departments. So if you go to a hospital with a problem, or if you go to your GP in hours, or if you go to your GP out of hours, all of those are the sources of data that they do look at on a daily basis. And these systems were mainly developed for the Olympic Games, and they are state of the art. What they are thinking about now is how they incorporate other sources of data, for example, ambulance data, over-the-counter sales, web activity through searches, even absenteeism at work, or social media data. And that's what I kind of like looked at for them, was whether we could use a Twitter signal to identify outbreaks of disease. So this is the kind of reporting that happens. So if we look at asthma, which is the syndrome that I looked at, you would then get weekly reports, and that happens with every syndrome of what is happening in terms of the activity with this particular syndrome. And if there is a peak that is outside the normal, because this will be looked at by a specialist every day, then they will have a public health kind of response in place to deal with this. So we see a lot of this daily, unfortunately, now with the COVID, because we see this kind of reporting going on a lot. So how does social media work, or why will we use social media? Well, not everybody will call 111 or go to the doctor, but some people might talk in Twitter about their syndromes. People use Twitter for all sorts of communications or other sources of social media. So for example, in 2015, somebody did a survey and there were already 33 articles identified as integrating social media into disease surveillance with varying degrees of success. So for example, there we have a map of reported heart disease as seen by death certificates in a part of America. And they predicted these heart disease rates with Twitter. And we can see that there is a real correlation between the two. So in this case, Twitter is a very good source of identification of heart disease. So it can be done, and it can be done very successfully. And in countries that maybe don't have very good health systems where they report to, Twitter might be a very good means of syndromic surveillance. So why do we use Twitter? Well, it's real time. So we don't have these delays that we might have in other systems. And it's freely accessible up to a point. You don't get the whole of the Twitter feed, but you have quite a bit of the Twitter feed. Unlike something like a Google search, which has also been used for looking at syndromic surveillance, you have more text. You have the whole tweet, so you have more context than a simple query. And also, when you have a Twitter profile, that comes with additional information. So you get a tweet. The access that you have to the data includes access to the metadata, and that will be all that information on the user, how much they tweet, the location if they post anything about it, and all sorts of other things that you can analyze. So it's quite a rich source of information for this kind of analysis. So when we did this first, we did it, as I said, for specific syndromes. That was before COVID. So we were looking at asthma and difficulty breathing. And we looked at tweets in English only to make the program a little bit more simple. And we were trying to look at whether we could have Twitter as a way to monitor asthma difficulty breathing incidents. So what we had is we collected data, and we do that by keywords. So instead of getting any tweet, we decide that there are keywords that might be associated with this type of things, such as pollution, smoke, poor quality, wheezing, and so on. And we collect the tweets that have those terms in them. Of course, the problem is a lot of the data that we collect in Twitter is completely irrelevant to what we're trying to do. So we need to identify tweets that are somebody saying, I have this now, as opposed to in the past or someone else. What we want is individuals reporting kind of like syndromes. So that then becomes a test classification problem. And we have, because in fact, what we have of the retrieved tweets with keywords, we will have tweets like this. So I used to have asthma, but I managed to control it with willpower. This is about something in the past, so not interesting to our surveillance. Or does your asthma get worse when you exercise? This is not telling you somebody has a problem now. So they have the keywords, but they're not relevant. Then we have something like having an asthma attack at the moment, walking up 366 stairs, other than that, fine. That is relevant. Why is my asthma so bad today is relevant. So we have to define a system for differentiating between those. And you also have the problem of the missing tweets, where they might say something like that, like aircraft today really getting to me feeling ill, but it wasn't identified by the keywords. And the language can be like that because the language is very informal in Twitter. So we have to learn to deal with all of that. So what we do is we collect the tweets using the streaming API. So in our exercise initially, we were looking at asthma and air pollution. We then have to clean the feed because there's a lot of retweets, which we don't want, repetition, spam, which comes from bots that tweet, or news articles. Then we need to maybe establish the location if we want to do this surveillance so that we know the tweet is in the UK or in another location. And then we do this identifying the relevant tweets. That's the bit that we focused on with our algorithms. From those relevant tweets, we generate a signal, and then we compare that signal with other syndromic surveillance signals and make sure that they work. So when we were doing this, we had in machine learning, there are different types of algorithms, what we call supervised, unsupervised, and semi-supervised. Generally, if you're going to do a classification problem, what you have is a supervised learning environment where you have your data labeled. So you know the tweets that are relevant, the tweets that are irrelevant, and from those you build a classifier. Unfortunately, this initial labeling is very labor intensive because you have millions of tweets, so it's not particularly good. The other way will be unsupervised learning, where you don't know anything about their class, so you have to group them somehow. And in the middle is what we call semi-supervised learning. And that is clever because you only label some tweets, a minority of tweets, and from there you build a model that classifies all the tweets without the labeling effort. So we try both types of algorithms, and what we ended up with things like supervised algorithms like naive Bayes, decision trees, logistic regression, support vector machine, and other semi-supervised algorithms that are a little bit more complex. And what we found that we were very interested in something called the F2 score, which prioritizes how many of the relevant tweets you keep in the classification, so you don't throw those away. And that's important for a strong signal. And we find that in terms of the supervised algorithms, they did well, particularly naive Bayes and logistic regression, but we got even better performance with the semi-supervised approach, which meant we didn't have to label the tweets. And it kind of like had an accuracy of about 82% on the data. So the conclusion is we have, with all this work, we made the building blocks for trying to do syndromic surveillance with real-time data extracted from Twitter. We find that the signal was initially very noisy, but we cleaned it and we improved it. Particularly, we developed text mining methods for looking at the relevance problem, which tweets to keep in a syndromic surveillance context, saying, I have this. And I obviously had to give you a very quick view of this, but there was a lot of work, for example, in looking at features that are important in Twitter, how people communicate, which is different. So for example, with emojis and emoticons, they are very important to the classification because people these days communicate like this in Twitter. So we need to understand those features as well. We are now working in COVID on the same, and we are looking at collecting data for the COVID-19 and trying to classify into 3 different themes. One is people reporting physical symptoms. The other one is people reporting psychological problems from the epidemic. And then, of course, we have all the irrelevant tweets. So we've done some work clouds we've already collected the data. We're in the process of analyzing it. So although the vocabularies can overlap, you can see that, for example, for physical symptoms, we get people reporting things like cough and hospitals and so on, feeling sick. Whereas when you look at the irrelevance, which is the majority of tweets, the problem with, for example, COVID is that the majority of people that are reporting on Twitter, they might be talking about political issues, the government, how it's being handled, and not necessarily about a syndromic surveillance context. So we have things like Trump being talked a lot, and other various things. And then for the psychological aspects, we have words like anxiety, worried, depressed, and so on. And what we're hoping now is to analyze all of this to get a much better understanding of how the epidemic is affecting people, both in terms of physical symptoms and so on. So that is the end of my talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Beatriz. Very interesting and very relevant in where we are now. I'm interested to know, what do you think are the main strengths and the main limitations of using Twitter data for this kind of analysis?
So the strength is, as I was hinting, that you have, you can kind of like take all of the population, including those that don't go to the hospital, and also perhaps in third world countries where they might not have access to very good health systems. You might also have these people. The challenges are you might not reach everybody because there might be a certain demographic that maybe doesn't use Twitter data. So you might have access to some people that report on Twitter, but you might miss a lot of the population that maybe don't use Twitter.
And finally, I'd also be interested to know, do you think that Twitter could be used to send out important health messages to the population as a whole?
I think that's one of the good uses that happens in health. Not only does it allow you to do this syndromic surveillance, but you can also use it as a source of expanding information, sending information. And there is studies as well as to how networks work in this way, who are the most influential people, who can propagate best. So I think that's something that's going to be very important in health messaging, is to use platforms like this to be able to reach more people and effectively.
Fantastic. Thank you, Beatriz. I think that brings us to the end of our time and concludes this particular seminar. So just in closure, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Anne-Marie, Saber and Beatriz for their time.